So, JD, are you comfortable with me mentioning your mental health on the podcast?
Sure, it's all right to include references to my disability. I think it can be important to realize that people with schizophrenia can also function in a sane way somehow, sometimes. There are many flavors of schizophrenia. Mine is chronic paranoid schizophrenia, and it includes hearing voices, believing delusions, and paranoia, usually about symbolism and overabundance of meaning. But I luckily have the ability to keep one foot in reality enough to realize what other people would see as delusional, and I usually keep quiet about what my sometimes hostile, sometimes friendly voices are constantly talking to me about. The experience is like having a radio head where people can hear your thoughts and talk to you in your head like a sort of telepathy that includes tactile. Have no doubt, though, much suffering is involved, and I am disabled, which is a major reason I couldn't get back into game design anytime in the near future.
Are you still in Oregon? I live in Portland.
Yes, I've lived in Eugene, Oregon since my sophomore year at Willamette High School in 1983.
Tell me how you got started with the Atari. Was it your first computer? What drew you to programming?
The first computers I actually saw were Radio Shack TRS-80s, the Sinclair ZX80, and the Apple II. Before getting my Atari 400 along with the first couple of issues of Antic in the summer of 1982, I largely learned to program in BASIC on a Sinclair ZX80, which I purchased in the summer of 1981 via an ad in Scientific American. I saw the ad while I was researching how to solve the Rubik's Cube with a screwdriver. I bought the ZX80 with my own money in 1981. It was about $200. My first computer exposure, however, was with a Radio Shack TRS-80 computer at my elementary school in the 6th grade, circa 1979, at Newport, Oregon, where I played an addictive Hammurabi-like game called Santa Paravia. I later emulated this on the Atari with a game called Empire. I remember that my very first program on a TRS-80 in early 1981 was something like 10 print hello followed by 20 go to 10. My mom and an uncle picked out an Atari 400 in 1982 to pay me for some extensive babysitting I'd done the prior summer. I hadn't heard of the Atari 400 at that time. A close friend in Bend, fellow Antic published game designer Jamie Sutherland, got a Commodore VIC-20 around the same time, and although the Apple II, Atari 400 800, and VIC-20 all used the 6502 CPU, I thought the Atari computers had an edge with their Antic GTIA graphics chips. My first experience with computers was playing games, and when I got my first computers, I could not afford to buy any games, so I simply programmed them myself. I found that I had enjoyed programming more than playing the games, which might have been an extension of having liked creative toys like building blocks, Lincoln Logs, Tinker Toys, Legos, Erector sets, etc. throughout my youth. I was always self-taught, working through example programs in magazines and reading the included programming manuals. But my approach was not to appropriate code, but to find my own way of doing things through trial and error. Certain habits, like using I, J, and K as variables in for and X loops, were incorporated unconsciously in my programming from looking at the magazine programs. It wasn't until learning about summations in college calculus that I found these using specific variables as a tradition.
Let's talk about your programs. Risky Rescue, April 1984 issue of Antic.
Risky Rescue, my first published game, was inspired by Nintendo magnate Shigeru Miyamoto's Donkey Kong. Not a terrible game designer to be influenced by, but I had actually submitted 2 games to Antic before then, Box In and Titan Tumble. Titan Tumble was a lunar lander type game. Antic accepted these games, but lost them and did not publish Box In till I reminded them of it later. Box In itself was like a game I saw on an Apple II computer at Bend High School, published by Beagle Brothers. I have lost my copy of Titan Tumble, so it really has been lost forever. Like Box In, most of my first game programs were not original designs of mine, including one called The Lost Ring, which was based not on a computer game, but on a board game called The Sorcerer's Cave. I programmed a few games by converting programs listed for other kinds of computers in Byte magazine, but most of my programs used reverse engineering, where I simply replicated the output with my own code.
Escape from Epsilon was published in June 1984.
Escape from Epsilon, my second game, was based on the Atari 2600 game Pitfall, hence the name Biffdrop, designed by David Crane of Activision. Again, not a bad influence. It introduced Sylvester Biffdrop, who, as I forgot to inform Antic, was a duck. Hence his Antic illustration changed from an Indiana Jones type human for Escape from Epsilon to a duck for Biffdrop. Sylvester was to be joined by his female relative Sylvia Biffdrop in Operation Omega. I wanted to be more inclusive in that game, and was also going to add the option of using the joystick in a left-handed manner as well as the gender option. The fully assembly language program was never finished because the game design was beyond the capabilities of the 8-bit Atari, and as I began to scale back the number of moving objects on the screen, I realized it was not going to be original enough to merit the programming effort. It was much like Pitfall combined with William Catherine Mataga's smooth-scrolling Zeppelin published by Synapse Software. Operation Omega did have a special level that was randomly generated with each new game. I completed this part of the game programming. I moved on to other projects that were more original, like Rebound, and what I consider my best and most original game design, Maximillian B, and I like the idea of the Omega, or last game, being unfinished.
Advent X5 was published in Antic's November 1984 issue.
With my third Antic game, Advent X5, I ventured into the text adventure territory. I had played some of Scott Adams' adventures, and had also designed some Dungeons & Dragons modules, having been deep into the nerd scene at that time. The language parser I designed was my first study of the relation between computers and natural language, an area of study that continues to fascinate me. I had to overcome the programming obstacle that, with Atari Basic, you couldn't have two vectors on a string variable. You couldn't simply define room string paren 1 as the ship's bridge and room string paren 5 as a medical lab. But Atari Basic did allow for you to use the restore operation to point to a specific data line. So I simply used that to use a numerical variable to address a specific text string, each room area and object needing to have a number value associated with a text description. My original hand-drawn map for Advent X5 betrays my youth at the time, and at that time I did not realize that my science fiction, and hence future-oriented or prophetic, word game's title had a Christian definition meaning the coming of Christ, and that the floor plan of the ship was loosely shaped like a cross, much like the floor plans of many cathedrals. The unfinished sequel, Clybex 7, was to involve a return to the escape from planet to rescue the animals left behind on the somewhat limited Noah's Ark Advent X5 spaceship. Antic put my name on the cover with the issue containing Advent X5, which was quite a thrill to see at my local Fred Meyer department store. Almost as exciting as the surprising discovery that Escape from Epsilon was going to be published by reading the coming in the next issue blurb in Antic before the editors had even told me it had been accepted.
Then there was Biffdrop in the December 1984 issue.
With Biffdrop, Rebound, and Maximillian B, I began to make games with more complex screen levels that were often crammed with as many novel uses of the obstacles as I could muster. Designing the screen levels was a lot of fun, and I therefore asked Antic to publish the Rebound construction kit and conduct a contest which I would judge. Happily they agreed, and even though I did not receive as many submissions to judge as I would have liked, I still had to use Federal Express's overnight delivery to get the winning screens to Antic on time. The rare version of Rebound with the winner screen levels on it can be found on my jdcasten.info website. The Antic character from the Biffdrop and Maximillian B storylines was a play on the Antic Ed moniker, and the Antic editors were always kind and courteous to me, even when I haggled up the payment for Maximillian B from $150 to $200 on the phone. I was noticing when going over the scans that Antic must have wanted to publish Maximillian B as a disc bonus in order to get more sales of their discs. The logic of the game is too long to fit on a disc didn't make sense to me, as it was a disc bonus, and my original code did not have the special characters. I guess they must have been balancing a money-making idea with trying not to seem greedy. They were frequently lapse in responding and paying, but now that I've tried being on the other side of publishing, with my micro-publisher, music label, web gallery, post-egoism media, I can see the issues involved with dealing with talent, and all the hard work that it takes to get that talent exposure. Plus, I was just a kid. The software catalog publishing division of Antic was a little less professional, usually late with their royalty payments to me for the Casten game disc, and completely forgetting to tell me the status of my submission of the Bonsai font designer, which I thought was pretty good, for which they finally sent me a form rejection letter after I called them about it. That, in late 1986, was near the end of my relation with Antic. My last programs were made in 1986, but by the late 1980s I was quite busy in college at the University of Oregon, having joined the Oregon Army National Guard, which included a stint at infantry boot camp, becoming the public relations officer for my local Alpha Tau Omega fraternity, getting into poetry, and helping edit the university's poetry journal, and finding my way to what I hoped would be my future.
In 1984, Antic did a profile of you, calling you their star game programmer. You were a sophomore in high school. Was that weird? What did your family and friends think of that?
Antic did that profile after interviewing me by phone, an interesting experience, as it looked to me like they altered my responses to fit a certain whiz kid nerd image they wanted to portray. I've heard some famous folks bemoan that interviewers take quotes out of context and whatnot, but this was not at all a public pillory, and despite my obliviousness, the success I'd achieved was hammered in by my ecstatically proud stepdad. My best friend at the time played through Biffdrop. I altered the game to give him infinite lives, as I did for myself to playtest the games, but for the most part it was a private time project. I only met one person in Eugene who knew about my games outside of knowing them through me. A science teacher at Willamette High School was impressed, and I did get a special award plaque created just for me in my advanced programming skills in the computer classes. Since high school, I've studied cultural criticism and have a more educated perception on being known. I'm a fan of the culture critic artist Nick Momus Curie, who's been quoted as saying, "In the future, everyone will be famous for 15 people." A take on the Andy Warhol quote, which pointed towards the internet and everyone writing themselves out in a blog and selfie image. No one, not even Jesus, is 100% famous. It's always a matter of degree and demographic saturation. You really couldn't be less well known and still be somewhat known internationally than I was, a sort of proto-micro computer celebrity. Like starting my micro publishing effort, post-egoism media, that experience was sort of like hitting the big time in miniature. I've gotten to see many of the elements involved with such public projects. The massive amount of work that promotion takes to get something or someone known. Just about every public work you've ever seen has been promoted by someone, usually for money, unless they're your next door neighbor's garage band. This exposure requires not just one, but a long series of lucky breaks, etc. Fortunately for me, I haven't had to deal with the downsides. No gilded cage, paparazzi, etc. Not even close. Just an occasional, about once or twice a year, email from someone out of the blue feeling nostalgic. Overall, my experience with Antic was positive. I got a couple of fan letters, was called their star game programmer, and quite importantly to me at the time, I earned enough money to pay for my computer and its upgrades. I was paid about $60 per published page. If I had been less oblivious, I would have included more text on how the programs themselves worked. I have been glad to hear that a few people did learn a bit about programming and maybe even game design by typing in my programs, which typing may have turned out to be as important for some as the frustrating entertainment of the games themselves. I have mused that my schizophrenia was the result of some sort of karma due to numerous frustrated gamers cursing me. I did find through a little research that my disease has nothing to do with the fact that I had stolen and ingested a dose of LSD that belonged to a friend of my mom's when I was 2 years old. This landmark experience was my first clear memory, and I think helped shape my future aspirations to become an artist of some sort.
Wow. Let's talk about Easy 80, the 80 column driver. Why did you create that? A departure from your usual game things. Why did you create it?
I'd actually made non-gamed programs before, usually to aid in the design of the games, such as BFD, the Bonsai font designer used for Rebound's animated character graphics. I don't recall the exact purpose for creating Easy 80, but there was a limitation of word processors on the Atari where the screen could not replicate the proper line breaks that would appear in printer output. I used the term driver in the 1987 documentation, an 80-column driver, not exactly like contemporary software or hardware interfacing, and I'm not sure where I even got that term, but it seemed in line with future developments, such as giving more complicated mediation and tools between a program and the input-output than the older operating systems less developed than Windows or Mac OS provided. The machine code addresses the problem of splitting the 8 display pixels that parallel a memory byte into two 4-pixel columns. Each character in Easy 80 is 4 pixels wide, so I designed a character set where each character is a double, like AA or BB, and the code would simply overlay a left A or a right A based on positioning. For example, a logical OR can simply turn on pixels in the left character column while not turning off the pixels in the right column when adding a new character in a series.
You had some unpublished things, the Bonsai font designer and Operation Omega. Can you talk about those? Why did you create them and why didn't they get published? Why did you abandon Operation Omega?
Again, Bonsai font designer was part of the Rebound project and fit with my turn towards the Rebound construction kit too, in that I thought design tools were empowering, as I liked making the games more than playing them. There were other graphic design programs, and I'd seen a paint program that had this sort of zoom magnification on a scrolling field that I used in BFD. I use graphics and music software extensively with my art now, for example Ableton Live and Adobe products, but contemporary fonts used vector programming. Having something like curve codes for each letter is much different than pixel font design. Evidently, Antic software was designing an assembly language font designer in-house, as when I asked them about the submission status quite a long time after submission, they said they were declining to publish in favor of the in-house program. Operation Omega was never finished, abandoned due to my overestimation of the efficiency of machine code. I didn't estimate the code cycles and the vertical blank interrupt I was using to sync the graphics. No flickering and mid-graphic motion breakup could in no way handle all the motion. I think the random sigma level generator would have made Operation Omega a standout, a new level with each new game. The maze generator code was finished using a wandering exploration algorithm, sort of like exploring a problem space in AI. The tree branches out, hits a dead end, backtracks to another opening, and then branches out again until the space is saturated. I modified that prior programming solution, not sure where it originated, by using elbow graphic pieces, a maze made with the lines, T's, and crosses that parallel the map obstacle pieces in the play levels. I had not yet designed the other 4 non-random levels, and probably should have made the Omega level the random one, sort of like my game Nemesis. Nemesis has a spectacular finale, but starts over again and again with ever more difficulty until it's impossible. I like the idea of an endless ending.
Initially, years ago, when I asked you to share Operation Omega, you said no, but now you have. What made you change your mind?
I've changed my mind about sharing the code because I'm older and more relaxed. There's no zero sum where someone loses for someone else to win here, so why not? I've learned to let go of opinions I might have fought for before just because I had them. Maturing can mean letting go, being less uptight, and admitting mistakes. But different folks need to learn different lessons in life, and I've known others who were too slack, letting either themselves or others act without enough care.
So you've just shared with me all the programs that you've written, some of which have never been published before. Thank you. I thank you, and the Atari community thanks you. Listeners, I've uploaded these to archive.org, and there's a link to that in the show notes. So would you please tell me about them?
Empire 1982 is a Santa Paravia Hammurabi clone game, 1978 by Reverend George Blank, published in Softside magazine. A simulation of a game I played on the TRS-80 in the late 1970s, my first major 8-bit Atari program, simulating observed output with my own code. Maze 5x5x5 in 1982, an example of my program translation. This was an Apple II program by Robert Suk called Quint Maze from a 1982 Byte magazine that I converted to Atari. Castles 1982, a replication of a 1980 Apple game I saw called Artillery. I figured out the math equations to simulate a projectile trajectory influenced by gravity, wind, and gunpowder force by trial and error. I had no clue about Newton or calculus yet. Newton's calculus ties into gravity, since both are about calculating rates of change. The falling object accelerates. In the early 90s, I had taken a similar approach to parallel distributed programming, coming up with a more efficient solution due to the textbooks at the time being too elliptical and pithy about the math implementation of the general approach. PDP were networks to a sort of stimulus response pairing that gets trained over cycles of adjusting output to input. This method is used in language recognition and predicting stock market turns, etc. Space Barrier in 1982. My friend Jamie Sutherland, who published 2 games in Antic, Arena Racer and Valiant, had a Commodore VIC-20 before getting an Atari, and the VIC-20 also had a 6502 CPU. Jamie got into 6502 machine code before I did, which gave me some confidence to try that. Space Barrier was actually his design, and after I saw his version, I made my own. Pacer 1982 was a Pac-Man clone. Pac-Man was made in 1980. I gave the Smash video game hit a try. My Ghost AI was like the monster in Box Inn. I didn't include the wandering that the arcade game Ghost would do. These ghosts float in your direction until they hit an obstacle. I don't think I've shared this before. The Lost Ring 1983 was a Dungeons and Dragons type one-player turn-based game based on a board game I had called Sorcerer's Cave. I actually had fun playing this game, and I don't know why I didn't submit it to Antic. Might have been thinking of the originality issues, which is strange, given that my first published games were transformations of popular video games. Snafu 1987, unfinished game due to the decline of the Atari 8-bit use. This would have been in the first of my games to use the sort of mixed multicolor character graphics found in many Synapse software games. I think it's a good design, original control. You walk and reverse gravity for vertical movement. And an interesting twist, the entire screen can flip upside down at key moments. The gameplay programming is finished. There is simply just one screen. More screen level designs would have completed the game.
Do you still have an Atari?
Yes, I still have an Atari 130XE and my original Atari 400 with 48K and a full stroke keyboard replacing that awful membrane thing. Plus I have a track disk drive and the 410 cassette drive. They're packed away though, and when I want to check out 8-bit Atari stuff, I use the Atari 800 Win Plus 4.1 emulator on my home-built PC. I never got the 16-bit Atari ST, instead using my Atari 130XE until 1994, when I finally got a PC with Microsoft Windows 3.1 and began to explore the internet via a phone line. I'd heard of CompuServe and GE's modem services, but didn't have the money back in the 80s to buy a modem or pay the service charges. I began system building around the turn of the millennium, usually starting a computer with an overclocking ASUS motherboard. I know many artists prefer Apples. I like the Macintosh computers too. A roommate had one in 1989. But I've gone the PC route due to wanting more software hardware system control, more video games to play, and also because I prefer the Windows decentralized hardware approach to the Apple vertical monopoly over both the OS and hardware. I've converted most of my websites to be mobile, replacing Flash with Java. It took me too long to realize the value of mobile computing. Although I still mostly use a desktop PC, smartphones have opened up the computing and internet information world to many more folks, non-techies, and those with less money, rural folks with no cable or phone lines, etc.
What do you do today, professionally and for fun?
I'm a professional schizophrenic, and I'm paid Social Security disability to bear the weight of civilization. Yes, that's a joke, but the post-structuralism philosopher Michel Foucault suggests that the world is defined by oppositions, much like a fence will divide one space from another, or juxtaposed colors like red and green will make each other pop out due to the contrast. In the same way, reasonable civilization can be said to be defined in opposition to unreasonable madness. Due to the 24/7 conference call going on in my head, even in some dreams if I'm self-aware, I haven't been able to devise any new life goals since college, but I've done my best to complete my early dreams, if only in miniature. I run Post-Egoism Media, a micropress and music label that offers free digital content and physical products printed on demand. Music is the easiest to promote, and my solo and collaborative works have charted on some college radio stations, playing on BBC Six, and have been downloaded extensively via free torrents. Due to the internal verbal interference, I can't write poetry, and my academic writing has been limited more to reporting than developing original work. I try to keep up on contemporary music and know quite a few DJs in the Eugene area, occasionally going to a local concert. I also have an art collection worth over $1 billion, but it's all in art book reproductions. My favorite artist poets are Katsushka Hokusai and William Blake.
If you could send a message to the Atari community, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, I'd like to apologize for the many emotional freakouts that some of my more challenging games must have fostered. I'd like to thank those folks who have contacted me with questions and comments. Quite a large portion of those who've contacted me had gone on to become programmers themselves. My original thinking about my Antic games was that I was providing art entertainment, which I see as a good thing in itself. But as I've come to develop my own artistic maturity, I think edutainment is even more commendable. And helping folks learn about computers via my type-in games, I find the results were better than I anticipated. Also, with the demise of 8-bit computers in the late 80s, I thought all of my work was lost in the past, which added weight to my life choices aimed at pursuing more stable, time-tested mediums like poetry and visual art. I was wrong though, and I've come to see that being of your time can be the best way to be timeless. And always feel free to contact me. I will return emails and enjoy hearing from my Atari friends near and far. I enjoy being part of a community that I'm surprised still exists.
Thank you, JD, for the interview, and thank you, Randy, for reading all of it with me. I highly recommend that you, dear listener, grab the JD Casten papers from archive.org. It is a trove of interesting material, scans of letters to and from Antic magazine, beautifully presented code and screenshots, all impeccably organized by JD. Plus, there's a file containing all of his unpublished programs: Empire, Lunar Lander, Castles, Maze 5x5x5, Space Barrier, Pacer, and The Lost Ring. You got ATRs and PDFs. It's an astounding collection of Atari goodness that JD has made available to us for the first time.